In a windswept park in Dublin, two dancers stand frozen in time. Their youth is preserved forever in memory of 48 young people who died in the most devastating fire that Ireland has ever seen. This is the story of those who find out how fires happen so that they may prevent them from happening again.
The Stardust was an event. There was always a good atmosphere, you know, because there was kind of a buzz about the place, you know. It was the place that everyone wanted to be. When the nightclub was on, you know, everybody kind of came from all directions. If you had cousins, you knew you'd meet them there. You know, it was ritual, if you like. So we'd all organised to meet there on Valentine's night.
On February the 14th, 1981, Jimmy Fitzpatrick was just 16. He and his friends were among hundreds of young people jam-packed in the Stardust. It was 20 to 2 in the morning.
There was a bit of pandemonium on stage, and the DJ this kind of announcement out that, ladies and gentlemen, don't panic, there's a small fire in the premises and we've got it under control. And so within seconds this bouncer had to run in with a fire extinguisher, and he went to the area where the fire was. Well, at that point I thought we stand a good chance of it now, because it didn't look that big. It didn't look like it was uncontrollable to somebody with a fire extinguisher. The flames were getting higher and higher. He dropped that and he shot off. So with that, within seconds, the lights are gone.
As the flames started spreading inside the Stardust, the first firefighters arrived outside the club. So too did a local priest.
The first thing I could hear was the sound of breaking glass, and I didn't know what that was. It was obvious there was a fire. Of course, you could see the flames inside the windows, but you could also see people trying to break out. I thought initially it was the heat of the flames that was making the glass pop. There were bars on the windows, so that people actually couldn't get out. And they were screaming and shouting, people pouring out of the building.
People were desperate to get out, and others were desperate to get in. Jimmy Fitzpatrick had escaped once already, but he went back through the flames for his friends.
There was people pushing in, shoving, and mayhem. You could see the smoke bellowing down. It was thick black smoke, you know, you could just taste it. It was that thick, you could, you know, taste it in your mouth like you were chewing it. It was burning. It was also so dense and hot that it just basically burned you, you know, there and then. I couldn't say a thing. I had my hands over my face because it was suffocating. I made a run for it. At this stage, I had no idea which way I was facing. I could have went straight into the fire. I ran the opposite direction through a row of seats. I don't know how I got through them. And I fell on the floor, on the dance floor. Now I knew because I was on the wooden floor. But because there's so many inches of air down there, I just got a good gust of air again and just took a deep breath. And at that stage the noise was deafening, like the screams and the flames and the wood crackling and everything else. I just made the big dash again and heard these people just kicking and kicking. I had no idea where it was. Could have been kicking a wall for all I knew. But it would turn out to be another exit door over the far side of the building, you know, and that's when the door just blew open.
All around the Stardust, the injured and dying fell out into the night. As ambulance crews raced the survivors to hospital, firefighters brought out the first bodies. In 10 short minutes of fire, 200 people would be injured and 48 youngsters would be killed. When the fire was damped down and it was safe to go back into the Stardust, the fire chief went looking for the priest to say prayers for the dead still inside.
So he brought me in, and we could see these, what I always think of as the like the dummies they have in the windows of a shop, you know, where you put the clothes on to dress them up and you can turn into all different shapes. But it was just like that. People, these figures, because all the hair had been singed, these figures lying in all different shapes, hands up, head bent forward, two people clasping each other, all brown, all brown.
At 8 o'clock the next morning, Father Heber finally went home. As thoughts of the Stardust flashed through his head, he started to think he'd been dreaming.
And I was going slightly crazy, I think, wondering, was this just one huge nightmare? And I always remember the simple thing. I was frozen with the cold anyhow, because I'd been out in the open a lot of the night, and the shock, I suppose. But I had this anorak, still had it on. I was sitting in front of the fire, and I just lifted up the sleeve of the anorak, and I smelled the smoke. I said, "It happened. It happened. You were there."
The carnage at the Stardust was Dublin's worst ever disaster. In any big fire, there are questions that have to be answered. Why did the fire spread so quickly? How could so many have died? Piecing together the puzzle of where and how the fire started was the job of investigator Seamus Quinn.
The area was like a sauna at the time that I went into it. The fire brigade were still damping down, and the steam was rising from the debris. The tub itself was totally burnt out. The seating was totally burnt out. The tables in front of the seating totally burnt out. Carpet wall tiles totally burnt away. The ceiling, suspended ceiling, had been pulled down. The lighting had been pulled down with the suspended ceiling. There was total devastation in that area.
Most witnesses told Seamus Quinn that the fire was first spotted in the club's west seating alcove. But when they were asked to describe it, he was faced with a conflict of evidence.
Some witnesses saw flames dancing some inches above the rear row or rear tier of seating. Others saw a coat on fire on top of the rear row seating. Others saw the fire spreading almost to the ceiling from the tops of the seating and involving the carpet tiles on the wall.
To confirm or dismiss what the witnesses told him, Seamus Quinn used a basic technique, a painstaking search, sifting through the layers of debris left by the fire.
We started sifting by hand, fingertip searching, which took us right through over a period of 2.5 days before we completed that search. We looked for a coat in the debris, but we found nothing to say that there was a coat there. We found no material, we found no buttons, so we had to eliminate a coat being on the back of a seat.
2 full days of searching revealed no clue to the cause of the fire. It was time for another tool of the investigator's trade, practical testing.
We took a row of seats and we placed a lighted cigarette on that seating to establish whether or not this cigarette would set fire to the seating. In fact, the cigarette went out on 3 tests.
Then he tried something else. He slashed the seat cover, exposing the foam underneath. Then he put a flame to it.
In all cases and in all tests, the seat took light and continued to burn and burnt out. And we were only left with one possibility after that, that the fire was started by a person setting fire to a slashed seat with the aid of a lighted match or a cigarette lighter.
So that was the most likely way the fire had begun. But that was just the start of the investigation. It was the speed of the fire which baffled the Stardust investigators.
One of the bouncers actually saw the fire. He went back for a fire extinguisher, and yet when he got back with the fire extinguisher, it was uncontrollable. I could not understand this.
To resolve this key question, the Irish came here. This was the hangar of the world's largest airship, the R-101, which in 1930 fell out of the sky in flames. Inside this huge space, Bill Malhotra built reconstructions of seats in the Stardust. Then he set fire to them.
Where the seats were joined together, the fire would spread from one seat to the next. Where there was a separation, between the seat, the fire did not find it possible to transfer from one seat to the next seat.
The walls of the Stardust had been lined with carpet tiles. Did these hold the key to the problem?
We made up a representation of an alcove which could accommodate 3 seats. It had 2 sides, a ceiling, and open front.
Then they prepared to light it. The wall tiles were soon ablaze, and as they burned, Bill Malhotra noticed something remarkable.
Because of the nature of the tiles, they produced burning drops, and these fell down and dropped on the top of the next seat. And that was the first indication of the seat in combination with the carpet tiles could have caused the seat across the aisle to become involved in the fire.
The investigators had solved the problem of how the Stardust fire spread sideways, but still they lacked the final piece of the jigsaw. Why had this deadly fire spread so fast from the back to the front of the club? In search of the final clue, the investigators built a full-scale reconstruction of the Stardust's west alcove. It was as accurate as they could make it, with identical seats specially shipped over from Dublin. What happened when they lit it caught everyone by surprise.
We had the whole rear tier burning within 1.5 to 2 minutes of the start of the fire. Very quickly after that, the heat was sufficient to cause the spontaneous ignition of the seats in the tier in front. And it was a matter of few seconds only after that until the whole of the 5 row of seats started to burn.
Everybody else! Absolutely clear! Everybody else!
It was as if we were repeating the fire which occurred at the Stardust.
The investigators had shown at first hand all the links in the chain of a deadly developing fire. The slash seat, the carpet tiles, the spontaneous ignition. The puzzle of Ireland's worst fire had finally been pieced together, and lessons to prevent it from happening again had been learned. Such deadly fires challenge investigators worldwide with depressing regularity. Hong Kong at last light. Time to go home for office workers in one of the world's most densely populated spots, Kowloon. Up on the 14th floor of the Garley building in Nathan Street, known as Kowloon's Golden Mile, stood the surgery of a busy dental practice. It was 4:30 on Wednesday, November the 20th, 1996. Everything was ready for Dr. Kenny Lung's next patient, when suddenly there was a knock on his door.
Somebody working in the opposite office came in and told my dental assistant that there is smoke in the corridor. As we look towards the end of the corridor, which is the lift lobby, we can see very heavy and dark smoke. I called my dental assistant to call the police. And she was saying, what? Call what? I said, yeah, call the police and tell them we have a fire. All I was thinking is, the firefighter will be here within 2 to 3 minutes. Look, this is only an office building. There is no explosive, there is nothing inflammable. So if when the firemen come, they could put everything under control within 5 minutes. So what's the scare for?
At Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport, helicopter rescue pilot Mike Ellis was put on a routine alert. Within minutes, what started as routine became one of the biggest emergencies Hong Kong has ever seen.
Operations told us that they wanted us to go immediately. People were now jumping off the building, and there was a great deal of urgency in getting there. It took us about 2 minutes flying straight from the airport at Kai Tak to get to the centre of Kowloon. There was a massive some pile of smoke over the building. Obviously the upper part of the building was seriously burning, certainly the 13th, 14th floors. And we immediately descended as low as we could to search for anybody who may be trapped on the top of the building.
At that time of day, over 1,000 people could have been inside. The firefighters brought up their longest turntable ladder, but to raise and lower it for rescue took agonizing minutes. Kenny Lung was lucky. He'd managed to get out. But for those still trapped by the fire, time was running out.
They were shouting for help and trying to escape, and it looks like the fireman is not doing anything to rescue them. So they start to climb from the 13th floor down to the 12th floor, and somebody grabbed their legs and pulled them into the 12th floor. I never expected that to happen in a commercial building.
The fire was raging through the top floors of the building. Surely no one still inside could survive this savage firestorm.
And then I saw a boy standing outside the window on the 15th floor. And then everybody was shouting to him, "Do not jump, do not jump." We saw fire coming at his back. After a minute or two, he just jumped.
His fall was broken by a simple tin canopy jutting out from the 2nd floor.
And my legs were shaking. Looking at that, I said, "Oh, man, this boy is dead." But miraculously, after a few minutes, we saw his hand and his leg moved a little bit. The fireman raised a ladder and rescued him.
15-year-old Soo Ki Lai defied death. He would survive a 13-floor fall and recover from back and leg fractures. With people jumping off the building, the pilots had to act. 4 people who'd made it to the roof were desperate for rescue. Breaking all the rules, they dropped their rescue man down on the helicopter winch before they were safely in position.
Very difficult to breathe, very difficult to see, eyes streaming. My co-pilot Johnny Lee said, you know, could we come up a bit? I think the paint's starting to melt. We established a good, very low hover, about 10, 15 feet over the corner of the roof, and lifted them all off in pretty quick time.
Despite the devastation, Kenny Lung still hoped his business might be spared.
Actually, I was praying very hard. I said, oh God, don't burn my office. Save those people, but don't burn my office. And all of a sudden, I saw a big fire burst out from my own office window, like that. And I said, oh, hallelujah. That's it.
The Gali building fire was finally put out the following day. Special teams went in with the hope of identifying the remains of the dead. They sorted through the debris, but the ferocity of the fire frustrated them. So the official death toll was put at 40. All the bodies which were found were on the top 3 floors, 22 of them in one burnt-out office alone. How could the fire have surged like a wave through the top of an ordinary office block? A public inquiry was set up. Dr. Ming Lau and Bobby Chung headed up the investigation.
The Gali building fire was a very unusual fire for us to investigate. Not only that it involved a large area of fire damage, but also because there was a large number of fatalities involved.
From the TV pictures alone, it appeared to the investigators that the fire was confined to the top 3 floors of the building. But as Dr. Lau and Bobby Chung prepared for their first examination, they were to make a strange and unexpected discovery.
When I walked in the building, I found that the lower floors of the building have also been damaged severely. It makes me immediately thinking about whether the fire could have been started on the lower floor and then subsequently spread to the upper, or whether the fire could have been started at the upper floor and caused such a severe burning in the lower floors.
So the first question was, did it start at the bottom or did it start at the top? They began to examine the burn patterns left by the fire.
Looking through the pattern of fire damage, it was very likely that the fire had actually started in the lower floors and then somehow spread to the upper floors.
Now the investigators needed to pinpoint exactly where on the lower floors the fire started.
The fire damage was more severe in the area around the lift lobbies. It was quite clear to us that the fire had originated in the area around the lift lobbies in the lower floors.
The investigators wanted to examine the lift lobby area on the building's second floor, but a metal door in the corridor had melted and was blocking their way. Once they'd cut through it, they could hardly believe what they saw.
We found all the lift doors has been taken off. The lift car had been removed. So when we look down from the top floor, through the lift shaft down to the bottom, there's like an empty tube running from the top downward to the bottom. And what just left behind was some bamboo scaffoldings at the bottom.
Suddenly, the picture of how the fire spread was revealed. In Hong Kong, bamboo is used for scaffolding. The bamboo in the Gali building lift shafts had been put up by contractors installing new lift cars. It's hard to imagine a more perfect or deadlier route for the blaze.
So when the fire was spread into the lift shafts from the lower floors, it burned upwards, just like in a chimney.
When you look at the Gali building, it makes me think that the fire was much like the Bunsen burner. Obviously, the ground floor opening was just like the air hole of the Bunsen burner. The fresh air goes through from the ground floor, and the fire on the lower floor generate a lot of smoke and hot fume, much like the fuels in the Bunsen burner. They mix in the lift shaft and then cause a very severe burning at the top floors.
So the investigators had discovered why 40 people died at the top of the building when the fire had started at the bottom. But just how did the Bunsen burner fire begin? According to the public inquiry, welders working at the top of the lift shaft had set fire to some rubbish at the bottom. It seems that a simple welder's spark was responsible for Hong Kong's worst ever peacetime tragedy. In the next 30 seconds, someone will deliberately set fire to this room. But this man's no arsonist. He trains fire investigators for the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms.
Today we're going to do a live fire demonstration and practical exercise. We have behind me here a room that is filled with common everyday furnishings. And what we will do is we will set an incendiary fire here. This fire will burn to flash over, which means everything that is in the room will be involved and burned, which is a true life scenario. Most fires that any investigator shows up on have reached the point of flashover, and so therefore they have to distinguish the damage in the fire and determine where the fire began and what the cause of that fire was.
ATF agents are as good as they get. They investigate all major fires in America. They also help train other fire sleuths who want to be top of their trade. After nearly 15 years in the business, Chris Pareca thinks he knows what that takes.
He needs to be able to think in the abstract. He needs to be able to walk into something that is, in essence, a black hole. You look into it and everything is charred and burnt, and he needs to be able to take a look at it and start to put the pieces together.
Perhaps the most incredible fire the ATF have helped investigate broke out above the streets of Philadelphia. Number 1 Meridian Plaza was among Philadelphia's most desirable business addresses. That was until one winter evening in 1991. At around 8:30 on a quiet Saturday night, Philadelphia Fire Chief George Yeager responded to an alarm raised by someone outside the deserted giant high-rise. He was about to step into a firefighter's nightmare.
When I arrived at the building, I got out of the chief's car. I looked up and saw heavy smoke coming from one window at approximately the 22nd floor. I felt at that time that it was a fire that, although it would be manpower intensive, as most high-rise fires are, it was a fire that we could successfully extinguish.
At that time on a Saturday, few people remained in the building. As Chief Yeager set up his command post in the lobby, a colleague went up to the fire floor. He started to hook up his hoses to the building's emergency water supply.
The first indication that I had that something was not right was when that he called down on our radio and said that the water pressure was low. We needed approximately 230 pounds of pressure. We had 45.
Without water, a firefighter can't hope to fight a fire. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare at 1 Meridian Plaza.
Then there was a loud pop, and all the electricity went out. It meant that every firefighter that arrived had to walk at least 21 floors. So at this point, we had no electricity to the building, no elevators, and very little water pressure. And the fire was growing rapidly.
It was just 90 minutes after the alarm was first raised, but the fire had already consumed 8,000 square feet of the 22nd floor. At around 10 o'clock, Chief Yeager himself started on the long climb to the fire floor.
As we got into the tower, a loud creaking noise occurred, and a 1-inch crack opened along the wall where the stair was attached to the wall. It was almost like the towering inferno. Anything that could go wrong went wrong.
By now, the emergency stairways the firefighters were in had filled with smoke and heat. 3 men from Engine 11 were sent to open the roof vents to help the smoke escape.
They proceeded up and at some point became disoriented or ran out of air or got lost. They radioed down that they were lost above the fire and running out of air.
And then they lost contact. An airborne rescue mission was mounted, but the men from Engine 11 were nowhere to be seen. The helicopter searchlight scanned the top of the building, and finally, they were found.
They had been overcome by carbon monoxide and were dead.
The fire at Meridian Plaza had now become a killer. By early Sunday morning, over 300 of Philadelphia's firefighters had joined the running battle, but the fire spread ever upwards. It had now laid waste the entire 23rd, 24th, and 25th floors. The fire commissioner was told that the building could collapse.
So his decision was to pull everybody out.
When they built the Meridian Plaza, automatic sprinklers were not needed by law, but tenants on the 30th floor had insisted their landlord fit them anyway. Could a few little sprinklers stop the fire in its tracks?
When they pulled everybody out, the fire was on the 26th floor. They stood and watched as the 27th, 28th, and 29th floors free burned. The sprinkler system on the 30th floor held the fire. 300 of the best trained, best equipped, highly motivated firefighters in the United States could not successfully extinguish what approximately 10 sprinkler heads put out.
New laws would be passed on the fitting of sprinklers as a result of Meridian Plaza. 8 whole floors had been gutted. $100 million worth of damage had been done, and 3 firefighters were dead. It was time for the fire investigators to start work.
I look at it as a challenge, like it's a puzzle to solve. And a lot of times, that's exactly what it is. You take material that was in the building, thrown out by firefighters, you bring it back in and you reconstruct it, and you're rebuilding the room the best you can. And a lot of times when you bring that in, the obvious point of origin just stands right out. It's just like you just put your last piece of the puzzle, and there it is.
I love this job. I think this is one of the best jobs in the world. It's hard to believe, I mean, because we often go to scenes that involve destruction and death, but there is a lot of satisfaction in figuring out what happened there and trying to prevent it from happening again.
It's an intellectual challenge to try to reconstruct the scene, reconstruct the room, reconstruct the building, and reconstruct a series of events that led to that small initial fire, which eventually resulted in maybe a multi-story high-rise building burning, or a full room in somebody's house, or an entire house.
To help solve the puzzle of the fire at Meridian Plaza, the Philadelphia Fire Marshal asked for the help of the agents from the ATF. On the morning of Monday, February the 25th, the investigative team started up to the 22nd floor, where the fire had first been spotted.
And what greeted me was just total destruction of the 22nd floor. I mean, it's an all-steel building with concrete floors. Everything was consumed. The ceiling tiles, the cherry wood paneling, the walls. It was like looking at a skeleton.
Everything that could burn did burn on that floor. The units that are used to hold the drop ceilings in were hanging from the ceilings. There were large steel girders that were twisted and bent.
It was a battlefield, and that's what it looked like. It was just total devastation, and your first thought is, you know, are we going to be able to find anything? Are we going to be able to determine what happened here?
The first thing that Bob Buckley looked for was the burn pattern left by the fire. But at Meridian Plaza, the investigators hit a problem.
The firefighters had an extremely difficult time getting any water to the seat of the fire or the main body of the fire. So most of our typical fire patterns were destroyed or damaged.
But then their first real break.
In determining the origin of this fire, we had a tremendous advantage in that we had the availability of a videotape that was taken by a fire department employee early on in the fire. And that videotape clearly showed flames in one room on the 22nd floor of this building. That put us into a room that was used by the Bayless and Company reinsurance firm.
The investigators had pinpointed the area of origin. Now they could start looking for the cause. Just like their counterparts at the Stardust, they started to sift through the debris.
What we did is we dug down like an archaeologist to layer through the debris, the fire debris. Because obviously after the fire, things begin to fall, structural members begin to fall. So we do backwards. We reverse the process and go through layer by layer.
The surface layers of the debris gave up no obvious evidence, but then they made an intriguing discovery.
When we got down to the bottom of a deeply seated burn, we found the remains, the coarse woven rag remains that were all charred and burned, of what appeared to us to look like some cotton rags.
That had a lot of surface burning on them, char on the surface, but in the center of the pile it was not heavily burned. It indicated to us that the fire may have started on the exterior of this pile of rags or in or around this pile of rags.
We asked the tenants of the space what was going on that was different on the day of the fire than had been going on all along since they'd been in that space for many years. And they said that they had hired a contractor to come in and refinish some of their wood paneling and solid wood doors.
We realized that this area was probably not being operated as an office, but was being operated as a storage area. We wanted to see if we could establish how many rags were there, whether they were old rags, new rags, used rags, and then gather that up, gather the evidence up, put it in an evidence can, and then have it tested.
The sealed and labeled evidence cans were rushed to the ATF laboratory in Washington. Analysis there showed traces of things the investigators would expect to find in a decorator's storage area. But the lab also found traces of something else.
In the samples of the charred rags that were submitted to us, we identified linseed oil. The significance of the linseed oil, which is a drying agent for varnishes, is that it is subject to what we call spontaneous heating. When it's in contact with something like a cotton rag, you have a chemical reaction that occurs. We have a heat buildup, and when the heat can't dissipate, it eventually gets to the point where you hit the ignition temperature of the rags and you can have open flame combustion.
Well, that's perhaps the most notorious of all of the types of oils that can spontaneously heat. Motor oil from your car, petroleum type oils, do not spontaneously heat. But some of the natural oils, typically what's called drying oils, like linseed oil or tung oil, principally used now in finishing of furniture, but historically used in most of the oil-based paints. And painters' rags were notorious for the last 100 years of spontaneously heating if they were not properly dried. So the painters would have to take the rags and hang them on a line so they could dry and the heat could be dissipated. But if you crumple the rag up, instead, it will begin to oxidize, and which is a heat-producing reaction. And if the rag is crumpled, the heat can't escape, and the rag can actually go into thermal runaway. It'll heat up and then possibly ignite any nearby fuels.
The investigators had put together the pieces of the puzzle. A steel and concrete giant was felled by an oily rag. Many found the story hard to bear.
When I first heard the cause, it was like, you're kidding me. You're kidding me. It was almost like hearing an 18th century cause for a 20th century fire.
Anytime a firefighter or anyone loses their lives, there's a certain emotional bond that occurs between the investigators and the case. You want to know what happened, and there's a need to know what happened. It's hard to believe that something so simple as rags left carelessly discarded could cost the lives of 3 firefighters and the amount of destruction and damage that occurred here.
Every now and then, a fire will leave a puzzle which baffles even top investigators. A puzzle which simply can't be pieced together with the usual bag of tools. A puzzle that demands a completely new approach. That's what happened in the story of one of Britain's biggest fires. On a cold November's evening in 1987, a deadly fire erupted at London's King's Cross tube station. A blazing inferno would eventually engulf the underground passageways and destroy the entire booking hall. But few would have predicted that when the first little flames peeped out of the stairs on the Piccadilly line escalator. Transport policeman Stephen Hansen was one of the first to go down and try to put the fire out.
The more I stamped it, the more I tried to put it out, the worse the flame got. And I knew straight away that it wasn't a normal fire at all. There was a lot of smoke, it was quite hot. But at the back of my mind, I thought, well, the fire brigade are going to arrive in a minute and everything's going to be sorted out.
With that comforting thought in mind, Stephen Hansen went back up the stationary escalator to stop the evening's commuters coming down. He would be in the booking hall for just a few short minutes when he was engulfed by flames.
The only way I can describe this is call it a living thing, because it was so massive in its entirety that within a few seconds it had covered the whole ticket office enclosure. I knew that I was in a dangerous situation myself, and that if I stayed much longer I wasn't going to be able to breathe. I arrived at the barrier system, which was metal at the time. The heat was that bad that my hand, when I touched the barrier to leap over, actually stuck to the metal. I had to pull it off, literally. It took a large piece of skin out of my hand, and the skin had melted, and the hands were type of bubbling. And as soon as I heard the screams, the fight for life, the undescribable noises coming from the actual ticket office enclosure.
Because he knew the layout of the underground station, Stephen managed to escape. Third-degree burns covered his head, hands and face, but he was one of the lucky ones. 31 people, including a senior firefighter, lost their lives that night. The task of working out the cause of London's worst tube fire fell to David Halliday. Once underground, he started to examine the Piccadilly line escalator.
Looking up from the bottom of the escalator, I could see that the lowest point of damage, approximately a third of the way up, was more concentrated on the right-hand side. So, turning to the right-hand side, I found that a certain amount of the steelwork in that area had distorted. Now, this was unusual. It wasn't the case further up the escalator, where it looked like there was a greater degree of heat damage. But right low down, at this point of origin, as I decided it was, that was where the steelwork was distorted and where the fire had been burning very hot.
Next, Dave Halliday squeezed down a steep and narrow stairway to examine the area underneath the escalator.
The only burnable materials that were present were a very thick layer of grease which had built up between the wheels on the trackway. It appeared to have been squeezed there by the natural action of the wheels over a period of time, and the grease itself was very dirty. It had a great deal of fluff impregnated in it. But I also found one other thing, which was when I looked at the skirting board directly above the grease on the trackway, there were a number of spots along it where there were small charred areas. These charred areas weren't very severe. They'd only led to the delamination of some of the plywood, indicating to me that there must have been, at some time, other small fires burning on that self-same escalator.
So how could all these small escalator fires have started? At the time of the King's
light, small fires burning on that self-same escalator.
So how could all these small escalator fires have started? At the time of the King's Cross fire, you couldn't smoke on the tube, but you could light up once you came up the escalators.
It's very easy to strike a match, light your cigarette, and then, in your own eyes, safely dispose of the match by throwing it forwards and downwards, away from the passengers standing above you on the escalator stair.
But was that really how it happened? The only way to find out was for Dave Halliday to test it. First, he tried to light a sample of pure grease.
The match doesn't actually do a great deal to the grease, apart from actually melt it. In fact, even if I apply quite a vigorous flame from a Bunsen burner, I still can't get the grease to light. It's a very different story, though, if you use the grease which is impregnated with the dust and fluff. That makes all the difference. The dust and fluff mixed in with the grease acts as a wick, and that's why the grease burnt under King's Cross escalator.
The story now moves on to the remote Derbyshire peaks and a bizarre underground tunnel. It's the place where a little band of fire investigators carry out their subterranean experiments. Their job would be to work out why this killer fire had spread so fast.
We rebuilt part of the escalator in the tunnel that we're in at present. And we rebuilt about 5 to 6 steps of that escalator to full size. In fact, using wood taken from unburned sections of the other escalators. When the fire had spread onto the visible side of the escalator, it spread slowly across the treads and rises of the escalator, and it also radiated heat onto the other side of the escalator, and eventually the flames from one side reached across to the other and ignited the other side, and at that point the whole of the escalator became involved. At this stage, we'd established how the fire could spread across the escalator, but what we hadn't established was how that fire would then spread up the escalator, a matter of some 20 metres, in a time which was probably, by most accounts, less than a minute.
But answering that question had Keith Moody's people stumped. It was time for something new. Enter 2 computer scientists whose speciality is how things flow.
The HSE are a little bit uncertain about the effect of the aerodynamics of the very complex tunnel arrangements and passages and the booking hall. They asked us to use a relatively new technique that we'd been using at that stage called computational fluid dynamics, and they thought that this new technique could open up some new insight into what had happened.
The HSE gave me plans of the tunnel and the booking hall, and actually more complex tunnels all around the system as well. But we decided we only needed to model that particular escalator tunnel and the booking hall itself. And I then had to transfer those dimensions of the geometry into the system so that the computer would know what the geometry looked like.
So Suzanne made up this spider's web-like simulation of the King's Cross booking hall and the 3 Piccadilly line escalators going down into the escalator tunnel.
What we had to do is to set up little bricks, like Lego bricks, connected all together. In each of these bricks, we would be solving the fundamental equations of fluid flow. They would all be connected together, and then we'd have to solve the equations in these tens of thousands of cells for many, many time steps to watch the development of the fire.
Once they'd built the skeleton of King's Cross, Suzanne ran the calculations. So complex was the mathematics, it took the computer 6 months before it gave results. And when it did, the 2 scientists were stunned.
The results were showing that the hot temperatures were near the floor of the escalator, and everybody knows that hot air rises.
That was quite a surprise. In fact, we were quite worried we'd got gravity turned upside down, for example, which is quite possible to do on the computer. So we went and checked that, found we had got gravity up the right way, but found that the escalator trench was actually the hottest part.
You normally wouldn't expect to see a fire lying low down, but what we were telling them was to look down, look at the effect of the fire and the wood that was all there, and from then on, that would explain the very rapid, the reasons for the very rapid spread of the fire.
Could flames really spread downwards rather than up? Could hot air really fail to rise? Was this really why 31 people died? Keith Moody prepared for the ultimate test.
What we made here was a 3rd scale replica. The booking hall was up on the top here, and the escalator system ran down here to an entrance area at the bottom.
Once they'd spent all their effort on building it, they stepped back and set it on fire. Was the most unlikely of predictions to become a reality.
As the fire took hold, the flames were standing up, but after a few seconds, the flames actually lay down in the trench and started to travel up the trench. Someone who was standing at the top at the time said, "It's just like Howell said it would happen," which was nice to hear standing at the bottom.
And the effect of that was that both the radiant heat and the convective heat from the fire were available to preheat the wood in front of the flame front, so that wood would more readily ignite, and as a consequence, that flame would travel at a faster and faster rate up the escalator. And anybody at the top would have been suddenly overtaken by a jet of flame emerging very rapidly into the booking hall.
It really gave people new insight into the behavior of the fire. It had shown them that the fire could spread in a way that was totally unexpected, and that effect became known as the trench effect, as a new phenomenon in fire dynamics.
So flames in a trench will stay low down, hugging the floor as they advance. On-site investigation, practical testing, physical reconstruction, computer simulation, all the available tools of the investigator's trade were used to piece together the puzzle of King's Cross. Following this remarkable discovery, undergrounds around the world were made safer for us all. The fire investigator's trade is rooted in experience, but it's always on the move. The world of virtual reality and portable computers has arrived. It could change the craft forever.
This is something totally new. This brings the fire scene to the investigator. This allows an investigator to come into a room, look 360 degrees around just like it's with his or her own eyes. Again, it immerses you right inside the scene. I can scan the entire living room just like I was standing there. I can look up. I can look down. I can change rooms. I can walk into another room and assess the damage in that room. It's only the beginning of what can be done with this type of technology.
But whatever the future may bring, the qualities a fire investigator needs will always remain the same.
Thorough, patient, curious, inquisitive, and they can't take no for an answer.
These harrowing images were recorded a quarter of a century ago. Once seen, they haunt the memory forever. 179 people died when fire ripped through this newly built office block in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The disaster made headlines around the world. But how could a fire trap so many people? It was the design of the brand new building which was to blame. Incredibly, the 25-story high-rise had been built without a fire alarm system or a proper fire exit. Once the flames took hold, there was simply no way out. This little traveling bag is at the heart of fire investigation. It belongs to Ed Camo, Chief Investigator for the U.S. National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA.
It's pre-packed with all the equipment and tools that I might need on a fire scene. For example, photography equipment such as camera, flash, film, things along that line. Protective clothing such as helmet, boots, gloves, warm weather gear, cold weather gear, and other tools that I might need. Flashlight, absolutely indispensable on a fire scene. Things like tape measure, spare batteries, what I call the cool tool or multi-purpose tool that I use on the fire scene. And all of this is pre-packed so that if I do need to leave on very short notice, I don't have to think about what to bring. It's already there and ready for me to go.
Ed Camo travels the world to try to make buildings safer. Safer for the people in them from the ravages of fire. His investigations form the basis of fire protection guidelines for building engineers around the world. The NFPA tries to persuade legislators worldwide to turn these guidelines into laws.
When I get in the morning, one of the first things I'll do is check the wire service to see what kind of fires have happened in the previous 24 hours. And essentially what we're looking for is what we call technically significant incidents. For example, exits. If a fire occurred where there was life loss and it appears that the exit design was an issue in terms of the life loss, well, that's something I want to go out and take a look at. NFPA is not interested in what caused the fire, or what's called cause and origin. We're interested in what happened after that.
Ed Camo would get involved in one of the biggest incidents of his career when he went through his morning routine on Halloween in 1998. A teenager's disco in the industrial city of Gothenburg had turned into Sweden's biggest ever fire tragedy.
It started just before midnight, and I know that 60 young people died in there, and maybe it was another one, we just found out.
Jag sprang ut först och sen sprang jag in och hämtade mina kompisar, för de låg där helt typ medvetslösa. Så jag försökte bara dra ut dem, och jag råkade trampa på massa folk bara för att komma och hjälpa dem. Det var kaos alltså.
They were about 14, 15, 16 years. One girl was only 12. They had a kind of Halloween party, disco.
Men det bästa scenen jag har sett, det var när en tjej, jag vet inte hur hon såg ut, hon var sönderbränd och det luktade bränt kött alltså. Hon var stel hela kroppen.
I can only say I hope it's an accident.
Outside the disco, there was a public outpouring of grief. "59 teenagers died inside the building. 4 others died later in hospital. 160 were injured. It is Sweden's biggest ever fire disaster. Three days after the fire, Ed Camo arrived on the scene.
Yeah, it is a terrible tragedy, especially when you look at what's outside, all the people. And I can't think of the last time I was out on a place where 60 people died in a fire. I know very little specifically so far. I've met with the fire department briefly this morning. They told me kind of a rough outline of what had happened that night, where the fatalities occurred and things like that, but I don't have a lot of details at this point. First thing we try to do is take pictures of the scene and then document the scene, because that's the first thing that's going to go away. That's what I'm working on right now, is getting some photographs, both the inside and the outside of the building, and then I'll diagram it and just try to get the layout of the building.
The building was a simple two-story concrete structure. It had two exits. One was at the rear of the hall next to the stage. This is where the fire started. The other was at the main entrance, some 40 yards away at the other end of the hall. Working with the Swedish authorities over the next 7 days, Ed Comeau then returned to the US to report on what he'd discovered about the tragedy.
One of the stairwells where the fire originated did have a large amount of furniture piled in there, because there were so many people in there, they moved furniture into the stairwell to make room on the dance floor, which created two problems. One, it was a blocked exit, but also now you had a fuel load in the stairwell, which you don't want.
And there was another basic problem. The room was designed to hold some 150 people.
Some reports put about 400 people inside the building at the time of the fire. So that when the fire was discovered and it started moving into the main hall, since one of the stairwells was blocked, everybody tried moving towards the other end through the main entrance to try to get out. This backed up very quickly because so many people were trying to move through that one entrance. So a number of people tried to break out windows and jump. Another large group of people tried to move into one of the side rooms inside the hall, thinking they could take refuge from the fire in there. Indeed, they couldn't, because about another 20 people were found dead inside of that room. This was a simple building, adequate exits as you would appear on the surface, but yet because of the overcrowding issues and such, it led to the tragic loss of life that we saw here.
Too many people with simply no way out. It's not a new phenomenon to fire investigators. The events of Halloween in Sweden are uncomfortable reminders of a landmark fire in America nearly 60 years ago. Another country, another era, another dance hall, another fatal fire. This one, the mother of them all. A Saturday night in Boston in 1942, between Shawmut and Piedmont Streets, stood the Coconut Grove, Boston's hottest night spot. Joe Dreyfus was 21. He was coming to the end of his medical studies, and a few months earlier, he'd got married.
Behind me is the original entrance area of the Coconut Grove. My wife and I had come to the Coconut Grove to see a friend off who was going overseas the next day.
Run by East Coast mobster Barney Wolanski during the Prohibition era, by 1942 the Coconut Grove billed itself as America's most beautiful nightclub. The warren of bars and function rooms were decked out in tropical style. There were artificial palm trees, coconuts, and other exotic decorations. Joe Dreyfus was one of more than 1,000 people trying to get in that night.
I was wearing a brand new cashmere overcoat and a brand new cashmere jacket. And they were beautiful. They were brand new. After all, I was a newlywed, so I spent some money on some clothes, I guess. When I walked into the nightclub, it amazed me that there were so many people there. It was hustle, bustle. Everybody was busy running around, and the people were dancing, and the music was loud, and everybody seemed to be having a great old time.
Anthony Marrow was a waiter on that fatal night nearly 60 years ago. At 15 years old, he was the youngest person in the club. At around 10 p.m., he came up from the kitchen into the main foyer on his way to the dining room.
and I see them all yelling. I said, why are they yelling about, you know? And what it was the flames were there. That's when I saw the fire. I said, oh my God, the place is on fire.
What I saw actually was a wall of flames coming along the ceiling about somewhere around 70 miles an hour, and it was rushing towards us.
The ladies were out of, oh my God, yelling and screaming, and the men roughing and bursting and yelling and swearing, you know, they're trying to get out.
In their bid to escape the fire, hundreds of people rushed towards the club's main entrance. But to escape the smoke and flames, they would have to get through a large revolving door.
One group was pushing this way on the revolving door, on the left, and on the right, that they was pushing the revolving door that way, and that door's not going to go.
My first thought was to get hold of my wife, and I thought I had done that. I actually thought I had done that, but apparently I never had time to do anything at all.
Firefighter George Graney was just a few blocks away from the Coconut Grove, putting out a car fire when he noticed a large pall of smoke.
I said to my partner at the time, Annie, I says, Annie, there's a better one around the corner.
When I started to feel the heat, I went down on the floor where they say it is cooler, and it was cooler. And that brought me out to the 3 walk-in ice chests, and they were already filled with people. And they opened the door and wouldn't let me in. I cried. I sincerely cried. I said, please let me in. I'm going to die. I'm going to get burned. I'm going to get cooked in here. No room. I said, I have to get out of here. So I went out by the back door. There was a window there. I got a whiskey bottle and I smashed the glass. I broke the cellar window. And I went out front, and that's when my friends, they all saw me. Said, oh, Tony's alive. My God. We're looking all over for you. I said, yeah, well, I almost got cooked.
It took nearly 5 hours to put out the fire and rescue survivors. By the end of that night, 490 bodies had been removed from the club. At the bottom of the pile, they discovered Joe Dreyfus.
And they took me out of the building, and then I was taken to the Boston City Hospital, and they had no room there, so they put me down on some corridor that was with a cement floor. I do recall that I felt my hands, and it felt like there was bacon on them. They all curled up, all the skin was gone. At that time, I was a 4th-year student in medical school, and the first thought that came to mind was, my God, how can I be a surgeon with hands like this? My hands are gone. The pain has been with me ever since the fire. There's never been one day without pain.
This young waiter, Stanley Tomaszewski, would be hounded for the rest of his life. Many believed the fire started when he went to change a light bulb in the corner of the Melody Lounge and lit a match to see what he was doing. But the cause of the fire remains to this day officially unknown. Casey Grant is one of NFPA's vice presidents. He's made a detailed study of Boston's landmark fire.
How the Coconut Grove fire started, in some ways, is academic. What really is the important issue is why did it spread as fast as it did, and why did so many people become trapped?
The deadly blaze had ripped through the club in under 5 minutes. One reason for its incredible speed was the club's luxuriant decor. The palm trees and the coconut husks were made of highly flammable materials. America's most beautiful nightclub became a victim of its own beauty. The record death toll wasn't simply the result of fast-burning palm fronds. Just like the disco in Sweden nearly 60 years later, the Coconut Grove was grossly overcrowded. 1,000 people were packed into a building that should have held 700.
Half of the people in the building the night of the fire died. Those are very, very high numbers in terms of a survival rate. Of the half who didn't die, half of those people were injured, many seriously. So if you were in the Coconut Grove the night of the fire, only 1 of every 4 people would be able to go home that night.
And just like the disco in Sweden, the Coconut Grove had a problem with its exits.
All of the exits out of this building had something functionally wrong. When we go and we look at the different points where the bodies were found after the incident and during the incident, we realize that they piled up at the primary points of exit. And we can see that at the door at the top of the Melody Lounge stairs, which was locked. It had panic hardware, it had a bar across it. If you pushed on it, it would open. But it was locked shut, and it did not operate. People piled up behind that. We see the door in the foyer, the main entrance, had a revolving door, and that quickly became jammed. And close to 200 people were found behind that revolving door. We had the main doors out onto Shawmut Street, and those doors were locked. They were unlocked early in the incident by a waiter, and that allowed many people to escape. But that delay meant that many people did not escape, and they were found around that doorway in the main dining hall. And then finally, we had the door in the new Broadway Lounge, and that door swung inward, and that quickly became jammed, and a large number of bodies were found there as well.
In the year following the disaster, building laws across the US were revamped. All public places were to have 2 separate and remote routes of escape from a fire. The number of exits into these routes would be determined by the expected number of people in the building.
Fire safety and proper fire safety design should not be an afterthought. It's something that should be incorporated into the initial design